Thank you, Paula. Welcome everyone to the Thayer Library here in Lancaster, Massachusetts on this beautiful Saturday morning. And I realize some of you are here at the expense of being in your gardens, so I appreciate your coming. I'm seeing some nods in the audience. I am going to talk about manuscript editing for writers, and a couple things before we get started. This is a slide presentation, but I have the slides in elongated format in a pamphlet on my website. So it's ursulawong.wordpress.com, and look for the tab that says Writing and Publishing, and you will see this. It's a PDF file. It has not been edited, so if you find errors, please let me know. But I go into the types of editing, which we'll be discussing today, various tips and tricks, finding an editor, so on and so forth. So please download it and read it and take notes and whatever. The point of this session is to have a better manuscript before you go into an editor. So I know one of you is thinking, well, I spoke to an editor who's charging me a fixed price for my manuscript, so why do I need to know all this stuff? Well, the thing is, you can start down here or you can start up here and then go higher. So if you have, for example, a manuscript which you have not vetted in a working group, or you have not edited to any degree yourself, and you hand it to an editor, they will do their job. But that job might include saying that your protagonist, for example, isn't well developed, or your romance scene is a little flat, or your climax comes way too early in the story. And all of those entail rewrites. And then once you make those changes in your manuscript, you're faced with the question, do I need to go back and have that material vetted yet again? So this can add up pretty quickly. The other advantage to knowing the material that we're going to go over today is that some editors charge you on a per hourly basis. So if you get a better manuscript to them, one that has fewer errors, it's money in your pocket. And the other thing, it actually makes you a better writer to edit. I am a writer, I am not an editor. But in doing 5 novels, I've dealt with many editors through my publisher, and privately, I hire editors also. And listening to what they say, trying to learn from their comments, especially the repetitive errors, I think improves how I write. And I think that, maybe if you embrace this material, it might help you in your writing as well. So think of it that way. This is not going to replace the need for an editor. Personally, I think professional editing is a good thing. And I'm going to talk about whether you publish traditionally or independently, how editing can benefit you in both scenarios. But personally, I think a professional editor is a good thing. I think not taking long material, especially to a professional editor, can be risky. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. So everyone okay with this? Everyone clear with what we're going to do? Any questions? Is there anything that you want to cover that I didn't mention yet? Not yet, okay. So feel free to raise your hand. Hunters, please use caution when hunting pedestrians using walking trails. Yeah. So we're going to talk about the basics of editing. We're going to go over some terms. We're going to talk about storytelling and writing craft. And this is something I think that if you embrace actually helps you in the long run with your other novels. A couple of tips and tricks for finding mistakes, and then we're going to talk about professional editors, how to find one, how to communicate with one. Not that they're a strange entity, but I have stories where a good writer, a Zoftig writer, hired an editor, assuming that editor was going to do copy editing. And that editor came back with line editing. So they didn't communicate to begin with. And, it wasn't a good thing. So we're going to go over terms. We're going to go over specific editing work that you can discuss with a potential editor just to make sure that you're going to get what you need and the editor is able to provide what you need. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so let's go into the types of editing. We've got developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. Those are the big four categories. When you go into material, you read about this, you might find editing cut out a little bit differently. But these I find are the most common categories. One catch is line editing. Some people think line editing is part of copy editing. It isn't always, so that's why these terms are so important. And another thing which you might do, morning Winona, one thing you might do is to actually take this slide, take this material in with you when you talk to a prospective editor and go over these concepts and make sure that you're on the same page when you talk through about what you need and what they are actually able to provide. Are we good with that? Developmental editing, okay, it's typically called developmental editing for fiction. It can be called content editing for nonfiction. Now, this seminar is about fiction. Nonfiction has its own peculiarities. We're not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about fiction today. So developmental editing, it can be expensive. It can be the more expensive type of editing because, frankly, it involves thinking about your novel. And it can be an iterative kind of thing because I said, if you get feedback that says you need to rewrite 40% of your novel, you need to figure out whether you need to do another developmental editing pass. And sometimes with an editor, when you specify developmental editing, they may tell you going in that they will do a second pass for free. My first novel, Purple Trees, I rewrote that more times than you can shake a stick at a dog. And it solidified. It was a long process for me, the first novel. But I went through developmental editing many times with my publisher, fortunately. He was willing to make that commitment. But it required a lot of rewrite. Some editors may take a look at your changes, your rewrites for free. But generally, they'll tell you going in that they'll do a look at whatever changes you've made and do a validation pass for you. Other editors may not do that, but they may give you a discount on that second read. And some editors won't offer you a discount. So, be aware of that when you do developmental editing in particular. Copy editing is the same thing, although it tends to be more contained in that it's, the changes are more specific. Developmental editing changes can be as broad as saying John Doe is not a well-developed character. Are we okay with this? Questions? All right. What developmental editing, I kind of put it into two buckets. One bucket is the story itself. It's the story arc. It's the arc gracefully tapering off to a satisfying conclusion. It's well-developed characters, well-developed tension, an interesting plot. Those are fairly subjective things, but those are part of developmental editing. Personally, I find those items very, very hard to judge in my own work. I don't know if the rest of you are like that, but I find those very, very hard to deal with. There's more developmental editing, which involves more or less the validation of writing, the application of writing craft. Did you use point of view properly? Is your dialogue natural and does it flow? Things along those lines. We're going to spend a lot of time on the craft aspect of developmental editing. And I feel strongly that paying attention to this as you go through your manuscript and see how you're dialogue is and how your point of view is and so on, how your narrative flows. I think editing that for yourself in your own manuscripts actually does make you a better writer, because you kind of see your tendency and you're able to correct it better. Any comments about this so far? Okay. So developmental editing is important to both writers who want to publish traditionally as well as writers who want to publish independently, and it's important to both for this reason. Regardless of what path you want to go, you are, especially in the traditional market, you are presenting a product to a publisher. The publisher is going to potentially buy your manuscript. It behooves you to have a manuscript that doesn't break any craft rules, that flows well. So it's in your interest to get a developmental edit, regardless of whether you're, even if you're planning to go traditional. For folks who are publishing independently, doing a developmental edit really solidifies the foundation of your story, so that if you need rewrites, and people in working groups or workshops and so forth, they'll give you some feedback. But getting a professional to look at your novel early on, especially for early writers, can be very good, because if you require a rewrite, you just do it before you go into the other phases of editing. Does this make sense? Okay. It's also, if you're doing complex plots, my books tend to have complex plots, and Paula gives me a lot of credit. I'm really not that smart. But my novels tend to be complex, and having a professional go through it and just say everything makes sense is a huge comfort factor for me. In fact, I get developmental editing now. I'm on novel number 5. I still spend a lot of time with my publisher doing developmental editing. I feel I need it. I feel it benefits the story and me, and I need that validation. You may not, but I feel pretty strongly about that. And rewrites are good things. If an editor tells you, the other thing to realize with developmental editing, you might get 2 different kinds of feedback. One kind of feedback will be, as I said earlier, John Doe is not a well-developed character, or your romance is flat, or your climax comes way too early. You'll get a written thing, a couple of page or 2 from the editor giving these generalizations about your story. That's one possible feedback from a developmental editor. Another kind of feedback, some editors will go in your manuscript and talk about things in there, point out problems in there. So again, if you're talking with a developmental editor, kind of feel them out about what kind of feedback you're going to get. Yeah, please.
How finished? Like a full first draft before you go through, before you start with developmental editing?
I think if you had asked 10 writers that question, you would get 10 different answers. I think that when you are at a point with developmental editing, with your manuscript, you're considering a developmental editor. If you've workshopped it, and if you've had a friend or 2 read it end to end and give you feedback on it, and if you're worried about your plot, then that's the time to do a developmental edit. If you're a little bit further on, if you have a couple of novels under your belt and you're fairly sure that your story is well developed, maybe you can do it a little bit later when the novel is a bit better formulated. I know a woman who writes romance, which we're not going to discuss here, but she writes romance, and she has a developmental edit done when she's almost done with the final manuscript. And she assumes that her plot is pretty good, and she just has it validated. So she takes what I think is a risk, but she doesn't see it that way. It's a validation point. Yes, please, Winona.
Complicating things even further.
Please.
Even if you have a really nice collection of short stories, there is plot that runs among the stories. And a developmental editor will look at these, and even if the stories in and of themselves have been signed off on, they need to be arranged in a way that you have rising and falling action, and there's a plot among those stories too, which means that once those are in place, the chances are pretty good that you're going to have to go back to some of those other pieces and tweak them a bit.
You're absolutely right. And when the same applies when you're doing a series.
Yeah, yeah.
So Winona's comment is, the development editor needs to look at your work in either a series or even in an anthology as a whole, as an entity, and make observations about how well it congeals. Are we all good with that? Any more questions? Developmental editing is a bear. We're going to talk about the big bucket of craft issues that you can handle, that you can improve in your manuscript. We're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. The next kind of editing is line editing. Now, some people have their material line edited, others don't. Some copy editors do line editing, but this is all about use of language, writing style, creativity, voice. It's all about that sort of thing. I mean, they're kind of nebulous items, but it's kind of the feel of the piece. Copy editing, on the other hand, gets down into nitty-gritty. This is about grammar. It's about sentence structure, spelling, specific word uses, regardless versus irregardless, for example, style, punctuation, tense, continuity, and fact-checking. When I write, when I'm doing my first draft, I do a proof sheet for my own purposes. I have a lot of foreign names, foreign places, events, and I create my own proof sheet when I am writing my first draft. And I refer to it all the time because I forget how old is John Doe, or when did Sally go to college, or how do you spell Beruto Shultovikas? Okay, so we all have our needs, but I find it very handy. Okay, so now copy editing is the mantra, the Bible for copy editing is typically the Chicago Manual of Style and the Merriam-Webster Collegiate Dictionary. So a copy editor should know, the references. They should understand them. I find them very difficult to read myself. Spunk and Wagnalls and Elements of Style, the Chicago. I find them difficult to absorb myself. But editors should know this material, and they will look at your manuscript according to the rules in the Chicago Manual of Style. All right? And copy editing, now for people who publish traditionally, the publisher will do copy editing for you, so you really don't have to worry about that. For people who are publishing independently, this is on your back, right? The integrity of the manuscript is on your back. So the basic story, the story development and developmental editing, that's you. Line editing, copy editing, that's your responsibility, as is proofreading. Traditional market, the publisher will do proofreading for you. The independent market, the manuscript is your responsibility, so you do the proofreading, or you have someone do it for you. Now here's the thing, proofreading is a final pre-publication read according to a proof. I believe they call it a galley in the traditional market. But it's a person who is, going through your material slowly and carefully to find instances of T-H-E-R-E when it should be T-H-E-I-R, little things like this that other people have forgotten, or as Paula mentioned earlier, a missing word. All right, the spell checkers won't get it, Microsoft won't get it in their tools, it does need the human eye. And copy editors are human beings. Sometimes they do make a mistake. Good editors make few mistakes, but, it does happen. So a proofread is a good kind of last pass thing for getting your manuscript ready for publication. But here's the thing. So I find with line editors and proofreading, there are people who make their living doing that work. All right, I'm not talking about those people. Sometimes you'll meet somebody in a class who is just talented with respect to identifying style issues in a piece, or talented with respect to seeing anomalies or errors. And sometimes if you give them a fee, they will review your book. However, be careful because I've had cases where a person has proofread my manuscript, and they've actually contradicted what the copy editor has said. So when you, and it's not to criticize, it's not to say that some proofreaders are good and some are bad. It's a fact of life. It happens. And when you get your proofing results, look at them. And if you don't agree with them, go back to your copy editor and double check. So my issue was my proofreader noticed that the word president in my last novel was uppercase in certain cases and was lowercase in certain cases. So she said it needs to be uppercase in all cases. So that was just incorrect. When you suspect something is a little off, go back to the copy editor or look it up in the Chicago Manual of Style. People who are careful and read your manuscript and give you feedback, it's a good thing. But just be wary, just be an intelligent consumer. Okay, any comments? Yes, please.
I don't expect a specific, but broadly or on average, can you indicate expected cost for each of these?
We'll get into cost later. To give you some heads up, writers will charge, some writers will charge by the manuscript, and it can vary. I've had copy editing for 75,000 words range anywhere from $400 up to $700. I mean, some writers, editors will charge by the hour. Now, if you are an accomplished writer and you really know the craft well, that may be a good option for you. I'm not comfortable with that myself because I know there are, writing wormholes that I have that really need to be addressed, and they can take a lot of time. Other editors will charge per page. Okay. All right. So it really varies. It's good to talk to a few editors. We'll talk about, finding editors and so forth, but it's good to compare costs for a couple if you're shopping, be a good consumer. Yeah, please.
The Editors and Freelancers Association lists
I have some, yep.
the averages.
Yep.
And as you say, you have no idea.
Yep.
Some go by the page, some go by the hour, some can tell in about 15 minutes which is most necessary.
Exactly.
But they give you a general ballpark cost. It runs about $50 an
Right.
hour.
There are two organizations that professional writers use. I'll give you the information on a later slide when we get into that section, so stay tuned. All right, so this is the most important slide in the entire morning. This is what you need to absorb. All right, and why do you need to absorb it? So that you can communicate with editors and make sure that you are on the same page, little joke, same page with them. Okay? So there are no surprises when you pay the check or you get your feedback and get the bill. All right. Okay? All right, let's move on. Everybody get it? Google? Yeah. I'm not sure how long that was up before they realized the L was missing.
Well, the thing is, so often we fill in the blanks when we see something.
Our eyes can deceive us. Yes, yes, I will talk about that a little bit later. I personally was fixated with the chocolate strawberry, so I didn't get beyond that for a couple of minutes.
I can see where a person's eye would make a mistake with the stem too.
Yeah.
For an L.
Yep.
You'd skip right by it.
Yep. Okay, so now we're going to get into the craft area of developmental editing. We're going to spend several slides on craft mistakes that you can identify in your manuscript. It all falls under developmental editing. This is how you can make that aspect of your manuscript better. So in terms of storytelling, the key is to tell a story well. It's to keep the reader engaged. you need to be familiar with the techniques of the craft techniques. If you don't know what point of view is, if you don't know what flashback is, if you don't know what foretelling is, if you don't know the rules of dialogue, take a class. There's several of them around. I think that Severn Bridge is having a class on this starting in September. It's a 10-week course. It will go over the basics. You need something that explains what these terms are, shows you good examples of what those techniques are, and then has you practice them, and you get feedback on what you write. So if you don't understand writing craft, and it's no shame if you do, just it's something you need to learn. Okay, this is not a story on craft, but I'll talk about how to look at your manuscript for craft issues. Read novels and study them. Read widely. Read nonfiction, read fiction, read crappy thrillers, read good thrillers, even read romance. Treat craft as fundamental knowledge essential to your job as a writer. Do you think Larry Bird ever stopped practicing dribbling and free throws? No. Tom Brady, he's all about basics. Writers, craft is our basic, is our foundation. It's our foundational knowledge. So pay attention to this and work to become better at it. I take courses all the time. I take webinars, online courses all the time. As you hear about point of view issues, for example, they can be convoluted, they can be hard to see. You get better. You get a knack for understanding this, and it is reflected in your writing. So I highly encourage you to study craft. Take it to heart. So let's go into specifics of the developmental editing. One issue that I see in a lot of manuscripts is plot but no story. So what does this mean? Winona's shaking her head. We had a small conversation about this, I think, a week ago. So a plot-driven novel, an example is The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. We're all familiar with that, right? So this is it's an interesting novel. I mean, it's got symbolism and history and, the guy's looking for the Holy Grail, for crying out loud. It has high stakes. It has all the elements of a thriller, right? It's a good novel. But there's no character evolution, right? It's about this search for the Holy Grail. Compare that to Gone with the Wind, right? Scarlett O'Hara, this Southern belle, a spoiled rich girl, lives through the Civil War, sees the devastation, the burning of Atlanta, and transforms into a self-sufficient survivor, right? That's a character change. That's an interesting character. Yeah, do we agree? The reason I bring this up in particular is that plot-driven stories are completely legitimate. Thrillers tend to be plot-driven. Action stories can be plot-driven. But you need to know what you're doing, right? Just like with sci-fi. There are reader expectations with sci-fi. You really need to be familiar with that before you undertake to write a sci-fi novel. Because if you don't meet the reader expectations, they'll do the worst thing possible, and what's that? They'll close your book, right? So if you're doing plot-driven a novel, know what you're doing. Study it, study the genre, study how the story develops, what you need to add to make it particularly interesting, to flow, and to create tension. If you are not doing that kind of novel, or if you're doing that kind of novel and you're really not sure what you're doing, make it character-driven. Make us care about at least the protagonist. Okay. The reader loves our character, we love our character, the reader will love our character, and they will do what we want them to do, and what's that? Turn the page, right? Winona.
Well, building on that, that's why many mysteries books are series, because through 20 volumes, you get to know that main character, but any single mystery is not about the character, it's about figuring things out. And so, if you're reading some of the old ones from the 1930s and 40s, as well as Agatha Christie, after a while, you know Miss Marple, or you know Clouseau. But that happens over 20 books.
Yeah, yeah.
And none of those individual ones really are character driven. You don't
Yeah.
care, no one learns anything.
Excellent
What
point.
happened.
Yeah, excellent point. The other thing, I recently read some statistics on modern day series, and this is a complete sidebar, but marketing statistics. So readers tend to fall off after book number 3.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah. They might stay with you for books 4 and 5 if it's really good. But if you're doing 6, 7, 8, your readership is likely, very likely, to fall off. Now, having said that, we have the Parker series, and we have all sorts of wonderful series, especially in the mystery area. But, you know, just FYI. Yes?
But as a reader, and I read a few series, I think it depends, I think if you make your reader fall in love with your main
Yeah.
character,
Yeah.
then it is not just plot driven, and they
Right.
will keep coming back because they like that main character.
Right. I think there's more likelihood of that. Yes, yes. I'm just reciting, I'm the messenger, don't you? I'm planning number 6, so, you know. So let's move on. Character and exposition, another thing to look for in your manuscript when you are doing your own developmental editing phase. With characters, some description is good. Early on, giving the reader an indication of what your characters look like is really good. You don't want to surprise them with, an unexpected age or an unexpected appearance, 2 chapters down the road. Right when you introduce a character, a couple of words about what they feel, what they look like. It's always useful. Kind of sets them in the reader's mind. It's what you want. And then if you need at that point to show us something about what a person is like, what a character is like, don't say, John was a bad man. Have John come into the room and say, hey, I just stole this dollar out of a blind man's, off a blind man. So, show us a little bit about that character and unwrap your characters. Some writers like to devote as much as a chapter to a character when they introduce them, or a couple of pages. Don't do that. Keep us in the story, keep it moving forward, unwrap your characters. It makes them more interesting. Are we okay with this? Having said this, everything I'm saying today, there are a million exceptions, but I'm kind of cutting a path through the forest for you. All right. Are we okay with that? Choose scenes over narrative. Okay, so this is, do you want to, tell us about a party and all the, arrogant rich people who are there eating caviar? Or do you want to put us in that room where we smell the slight odor of the fish, and there are people in elegant clothing and tuxedos walking around and, whatever? Put us in the scene. Put the reader in the scene. It's much more interesting for them. It's fun for us, too, as writers. Because we can imagine this, right? So show us. Show us more than telling us. Some telling is good. You need some of that. You need plain narrative, right? But try to keep a balance. Comments, thoughts? This is really hard. I find a lot of writers, I read a lot of manuscripts, and I find that even more advanced writers fall into the trap of telling versus showing. So it's something to really keep in the back of your mind. Yes, Paula, please.
I just want to mention for folks who aren't aware that, Seven Bridge offers critique groups, and in the critique groups, a lot of what they do is when folks bring their first drafts of their manuscript, we do a lot of this developmental critiquing where we'll say, this scene doesn't seem like it's a scene, it seems like you're telling us things more, and you might want to consider that, or we'll say, this character doesn't seem realistic to us, or your story seems to start on page 50 instead of 1, and so, so that's another way of getting some of the feedback that you can use to do your own editing.
I'll talk about critique groups and workshops, and I'll look your way when we do that in a couple of slides so you can put in another plug for Seven Bridge because we do have a wide variety of offerings for the community. Okay, so RUE, resist the urge to explain. Do you have a hobby?
Yes,
Would you mind telling us what it is?
knitting.
Knitting. If you're doing a novel about knitting, a novel, and you have a character in there who knits, and it's a mystery, let's say it's a mystery for the purposes of argument, don't have a chapter on how to knit. Just tell us what we need to know about knitting in order to advance the plot. Please.
I see lots of examples of how you might be able to get away with it, like a character who does some explaining, or, there are ways of
Yes.
getting that across even in scenes.
Yes,
The
there is.
character could be kind of flaky and still get in what you need them to know about knitting.
Absolutely, and that is valuable. That is valuable. Don't take the reader out of the story by putting all of that stuff right together and doing a diatribe. Spread it out. Make it interesting. Throw your seeds of narrative onto the garden of your manuscript, right? Don't use a litter. But you get the point. We have the idea? We get the idea? Okay. So again, gradually unwrap the characters, avoid flat, underdeveloped characters. Make your protagonists, give them, make them not so nice. Make your antagonists, make them like cats or something. I mean, add some dimension to your characters. Don't have your bad characters be all bad. Don't have your good characters be all good. Mix it up a little bit. We'll talk about mixing up dialogue, having your characters lie and be deceitful and so forth. But, it's the way we all are at various times in our lives, right? I hope it's right. It's just me. Yes, please.
I just wanted to throw in a comment. We were watching a show, my wife and I, a couple of years ago. It was a new show and it was all hyped and all that. And I watched about 20 minutes of it. And I can't watch this. And Linda goes, why? I said, well, the characters are all cliches.
Oh, yeah.
And that's to your point,
Oh, yeah. Writing spoils you for reading. Absolutely. Yes. Please.
Those stock cliched characters that Ray reasonably picked up are difficult for beginning writers because those characters might have been fresh as they're rounded in 1810, but they're not fresh now.
Yeah.
The prostitute with the heart of gold. Well, that was interesting in 1850, but now it's cliched and it's not, and we know everything we need to know about the person, and so why are we watching this?
Okay. But so the point is, make your characters interesting. Don't make them cliche. Don't fall into that hole. Put your librarians in leather. Make them unusual. Make them stick in the reader's mind. All right. So let's move on. Another aspect of developmental editing that you, as a writer, can get a handle on in your manuscript. Point of view. So, first person, the I voice. A lot of memoir is done in the I voice. My first novel is done in the I. Ray, was your first novel done in the I voice?
going back and forth with it.
Okay. The I voice can be very personal, very intimate. But if you stay in a character's head for a long time, the reader can back off. It can be very heavy for the reader. And another thing to be aware of is that the I voice shows a limited perspective, right? It's what I see. It's what I am aware of. It's not what that guy is aware of. It's just me. So something may be going on, and the I character may see it, they may react to it, but they don't necessarily know, right? So keep that in mind. And also the I voice, this intimate voice, it's in your head. Nothing's going on, right? It can be very boring. I mean, I'm sure we're all very intellectual and, we're fascinating people individually, but writing in the I voice and staying in a head for an extended period of time can just be a sleeper for the reader. Okay? Now, the omniscient narrator, the narrator that knows all, sees all, that allows for a lot of perspective. It's perfectly legitimate. I think third person tends to be a natural voice for a lot of us. I write my series is in third person. One thing you can do easily with third person is use distance. So, she walked into the room and noticed a woman in the corner dressed in a tattered coat. She thought the woman was poor, maybe something was going on, but the woman dabbed her eye. So as she went closer to the woman, she noticed something that brought the, I'm trying to make this up on the fly and it's not working very well, but I'm trying to say with the third person voice, you can act like a movie camera, right? You can see from a distance and get in close, and you can actually go into that party's head if you want with third voice. She was obviously sad, or she was sad, or something like this, but you can go into the head and then you can go back out. That is really interesting for the reader to vary that distance. But think of your writing perspective like a camera, and you go in for a close shot right into the brain, and then you back out. That can be very good for the reader. Okay? We clear on that? Apologies for the example, but are we clear? Yes, please.
Can you go that close in? Are you actually going into that person's thoughts?
You can.
How do you make that work? Do you change paragraphs? How do you make it clear?
Sally knew she was getting sick. She felt it in her bones. That's third person that's writing close to Sally's brain. Yes?
However, it's not a good idea to bounce from person's head to person's head.
Yeah,
to person's
right.
head.
Point of view shifts.
Right, that's going to be.
So what Winona's saying is that stay in a person's head for a while. And with modern novels, I think the rule of thumb is that if you are going to go from your head to your head, right, delineate it somehow, put a chair in the middle, put some white space, make it a different chapter, but help the reader make that transition. So having said that, Virginia Woolf, she goes from head to head, sometimes in the same sentence. It's ridiculous. And it works for her. But, that's Virginia Woolf. Lonesome Dove, McMurtry's Lonesome Dove. He's going into heads all the time. And I don't know if it works. It's a it's a hugely successful novel, Lonesome Dove series. But, that part is kind of hard. So don't do it. Don't make it hard for your reader to follow whose head you're in. Make it easy for them, because if they get frustrated, what are they going to do? Close the book, right? And we want them to turn the page. Of course, it doesn't work if you're doing electronic, but All right, so let's go on. Another aspect of developmental editing that you can control, that you can look at in your novel, proportion. All right, so this is the idea. Too much detail, too much dialogue, too many subplots, too much character information. What you can do is look at really examine the first 50 or so pages of your manuscript. And note the white space. If you've got a lot of white space, maybe that's an indicator. Too much terse dialogue, maybe you want to look at that. If you have long paragraphs, very long paragraphs, maybe you want to break them up. Not only in terms of visually, but in terms of the logic of those paragraphs. All right? So note the white space, note the amount of dialogue and so forth. Other things, when you're doing dialogue, don't interrupt the dialogue. Okay? People are having a conversation. Don't have one character say something and then add a couple of paragraphs of exposition explaining why the character said that. Don't do that in the dialogue. It really takes the reader out. Have the dialogue include the, whatever you need, whatever exposition, briefly. A sentence or two, would probably work. But leave the big explanations when you're outside the dialogue. We okay? Yeah? And vary the activity. when you're doing dialogue, dialogue is the next item. So when you're doing dialogue, one good thing is to read it aloud. All right? And when you're reading the dialogue aloud, sometimes you're going to put in a pause. And pay attention when you do that naturally. When you're reading your own dialogue, you may put in a pause when you're reading that. If you do that, think about whether it's a comma or whether you need that character to put their chin on their hand, or whether you need to do something to kind of introduce that rhythm, that pause, to build up the rhythm of that dialogue. Does that make sense? You understand what that is? But vary what they do. Don't have the readers put their hand on their chin every time, or don't have them light a cigarette every time, because all the characters can't be the same. They all need to be different, right? So vary the activity that you introduce for these pauses. And the best way to review dialogue is to read it aloud. Read how it sounds. Read your dialogue aloud. If you can get somebody to listen to it, that's even better, because you can react to how they're reacting to your dialogue. You can kind of make note of that. And review the rules of dialogue. Look them up. Follow them. Paragraphs, simple tags, that sort of thing. All right. Avoid repetition. Repetition's a big one, especially for a series. So repetition, this notion, in one sense it can be a paragraph where you say what you're saying in the paragraph in the first sentence, and then you explain all of it. You don't necessarily need both, right? That's repetition of a sort. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? You can have repetition in a chapter, you can have repetition in a chapter, you can have repetition in a novel, right? This is harder to find, but think about things. Think about whether, if you're telling your readers that uranium is a bad thing, tell them once. Don't keep telling them during the story, for example. I mean, that's a fairly simple thing, but don't repeat your thoughts. If you have a series and you've got a romance going on among different sets of people, vary the romance. Don't have it feel the same for all of the people. Vary it. Don't repeat. All right. Are we okay with this?
Well, I'm reading a series, the one who writes on the vineyard. And I kind of like some of the repetition she does between books, because it reminds me of, it's mostly setting details that she'll say it almost the same way, and I do recognize it, but it makes them as standalone.
Yeah.
It makes them much better.
Yeah, that's a good point. These rules are not hard and fast, Esther.
You know me, I like to find examples of people breaking rules
Yeah.
and when it works.
Yeah. And it is a literary tool. Repetition can, sound right in certain cases. So, not hard and fast.
Grisham uses it too, which in helpful ways, because you don't, his books are long.
Yeah.
And you don't always remember a detail from the beginning to the end chapter, and he'll touch on it again.
Right. I do deliberate repetition in Black Amber, which will be out this fall. But it's about the oil industry. And so there's some concepts that I kind of repeat a few times, thinking that my readership may not latch onto it because they're not necessarily experts in the field. And I think with Hacker, you're in the same kind of thing with your novel Hacker, where you might say the same thing in slightly different way just to reinforce that you have to judge the scenarios yourself, but be aware of this. And this can be really hard to find in your own stuff, because sometimes you don't feel that it's a repetition, even though it is. You see it differently.
People don't know.
Exactly. All right. Avoid tangents. We already talked about that. Italics. The copy editor I use likes to use italics, and she uses them for emphasis. If you use a lot of italics, readers, what I hear from statistics, again, I'm just the messenger, readers don't necessarily like to read italics. So Having said that, I have 2 chapters of italicized chapters in Amber Wolf. So be wary of italics. Be aware. It may work, but, it may be distracting too. And avoid the she thought, he thought attributes, right? I do that all the time. It was a sunny day, she thought. I mean, if we're in her head already, if we know the point of view of the character, we don't need the she thought, he thought attributes. Are we clear on this? Yeah. Anything else? Oh, here we go. The value of copy editing. Do we want to take a quick break, or should we power through? How are people feeling? Do we want to, Paula, should we take a 5-minute break? No? You tell me.
People can feel free to get up anytime to get snacks if you want to keep going.
Okay, let's go through. Putting all of these developmental editing items in a nutshell. Again, make us care about your protagonist at least. Especially if you're not really an expert at a thriller genre or an action genre or a plot-driven genre. Make us care about your protagonist. It'll transition you, all right, so that your reader will have something to latch onto. Give your characters tangible goals. Have them look for the Holy Grail, right, so to speak. Provide clear motivation. Why are your characters doing this? And this is stuff you can think about. You created these fictional characters. These were your best friends for a long time while you were writing your novel. So, think about their motivation and be clear about it. And, one thing you can easily do, for your protagonist. This is the story where the protagonist came to the realization that he had inadvertently caused his family great harm by moving to the Yukon. I don't know. But if you can answer that question for your story, that's good. If you can't, think about your character. Okay? Yes, please.
Also, we should learn how to make our readers care about the bad guys.
I completely agree. Care about the good guys, care about the bad guys. Put some good in your bad guys, put some bad in your good guys, mix it up. Amber Widow. I have Vera Kozlova, a bad Russian lady, and my readers love her. Personally, as a writer, I don't care who you love, as long as you love somebody in the novels, right? It can be the good guy, the bad guy, but think about making them multidimensional. It makes them more real, makes them feel more real. You can have a lot more fun with them too. So that's a good point, Winona. It's okay to love your bad guy, right? Use your plot to move your character through their changes. Scarlet, right? The burning of Atlanta. Scarlet transformed during the burning of Atlanta. She's going through she saw the flames in the distance, and this transformed her, this changed her. So use the plot to move your character through their changes. Have a strong central story question. Every scene needs to move the story forward. Create some tension. All right, easier said than done. We were talking about proportion. In terms of tension, in terms of action in particular, but in terms of tension, sometimes a few well-placed short sentences, that can kind of just speed it up, right? Sometimes a few well-placed short chapters can also create the feeling of tension, as opposed to a longer chapter that lulls the reader into this, sense of calm and, whatever, and then you hit them with a short chapter where you've got a lot of tension. So vary things, change the proportion in that way. Think about tension. Thoughts, questions? It's a lot. Now, do you agree that focusing on these things is going to help you? Yeah. Now, here's the bad news. If you take these items seriously, I mean, if you go home and you go through this thing and you create a little thing for yourself, I'm going to check point of view, I'm going to check dialogue, and so on and so forth. You may not be able to do it all in one read of your manuscript. You may have to go through your manuscript many, many times. And I know my own case in my first novel, when you finish that first manuscript, that first draft, you say, okay, I'm done, this is it. And then, of course, you get your feedback, and then you realize that, you just really started. So, it may take several reads, several examinations of your manuscript to get all this done. For characters, what I do for characters, at least for the main character, the good guy and the bad guy, I bring up my manuscript in an editor, and I search for the name of the protagonist or antagonist, but I do it one at a time. So I will see all instances of John Doe. I'll go through all instances, and I will think, is the character really progressing? Am I showing enough about, how this character is a good guy or a bad guy or ambivalent? But I do it one character at a time, and I find that to be a useful technique. It can take a little time to do it, but I find it very, very useful. And do that for a few characters. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to add a point that I found, probably a lot of people agree with, that, I can work on something and work it, but putting it away for a period of time,
Oh, yeah.
and then that's when my best work happens. I'll pick something up that maybe I wrote, a year ago, or whatever, and I'll just fix the heck out of it.
Yeah.
And I know, like you said, when you write something, you think you got it right, now you want to do something with it. And we have a tendency to want to push ahead with it, and really what it needs is some time in the drawer.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, you're absolutely right. Stepping away from your manuscript for a little while, even if you can afford only a week, that's a good thing. If you can afford a year, all the better, because you really forget, and then you can look at it with very fresh eyes. Yes, please.
Just building on what Ray said, and I don't remember who told me this, but when she reaches that point where she figures she's farther close to done, she sends the manuscript off to Kinko's and has it printed out. And then she goes back, and picks up the box and starts reading it. There is this psychological as well as physical distance that makes those last passes through very, very different from when you're printing out, reading it.
Yeah, I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but absolutely, if you change something about the novel in terms of the visualization, in other words, you print it on paper, or you change the size of the characters on the screen, that can help you see a lot of things different. It can force you to read.
Back to you.
Yeah.
You pick up the package and it's
And that whole aspect of getting it and opening it is a fresh experience for the novel. Okay, that's interesting.
Even just moving it from Scrivener to Microsoft Word
Yeah.
gets a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Or back.
Okay, good. So the next, workshops and critique groups. So I think we're all familiar with who's in a workshop or critique group right now? No? No? Okay, most of us, yeah. Seven Bridge has many of them. We're ending up with, this year over the next month or so, right, Paula? And then we'll be doing again in September. But we have a lot of critique groups and workshops, and these are, meetings generally of like-minded writers who review each other's work, simply. It is a great way to get feedback on your material. And, with the Seven Bridge critique groups, I believe all of them allow you to put in 20 pages per month. Yeah, so 12 months you can finish a novel. So it's a long time, but it's not a long time. One advantage is that you get, 4 or 5 or 6, if you're lucky, 6 people reading your manuscript and who get engaged and tell you about it, Are your characters well developed? Does this scene work? Are you showing, telling too much and not showing enough? Are you front-loading your characters? You know, they can give you all of this feedback in those critique groups. They're very, very valuable, very good in terms of making your manuscript better and ultimately lowering your editing costs. So these are a good thing. They make you a better writer, too. Annie, did you have a?
I just wanted to add that one of the things I've found helpful, when I discover I reuse the word a couple times on a page, I'll start at the top and do a word search for that word, and I'll find how many times I've used it. It becomes very habitual sometimes.
Yeah, very, very true. I have a slide on that. Actually, in the handouts, there's actually a, I talk about doing that, but Annie's right. Sometimes you repeat words and you shouldn't be doing it. And, you know, with Microsoft Word, I think you've got to be aware of what candidate words to search for. Like, for instance, pick a word,
I
shudder.
got to start with very.
Very, all right, very. So, you know, you can search for it and see how many times you use it, and if it's a lot, you can cut it down. But you need to have some sense. Now, Scrivener, I think, will give you statistics on your words. So you will see it like a CSV file, or you know, or a table, a formatted table, and you'll see each word and how many instances of it in Scrivener. So, you know, different techniques for learning this, but absolutely right. Worry about how much you use a single word. You can see it in a paragraph. It's easier to see it in a paragraph. But if you see it in a paragraph, then you know maybe it's probably, you know, a word that you're really overusing elsewhere as well. So back to the workshops and critique groups. The catch-22 with workshops and critique groups for you to be aware of is that, you know, if it's on a monthly basis, even if it's on a weekly basis, weekly critique groups tend to read shorter amounts, right? Monthly, 20 pages. Weekly, it might only be 2 or 3 or 4 pages. So, you know, it depends on the group. But the problem in both areas is that it takes a while to review the entire manuscript. And by the time you get to the end, you know, many readers have forgotten what happened in the beginning. So getting this overall, is the story arc good? Is the, you know, ending satisfying? Are the characters well developed? Those overarching questions are hard for a critique group. Now, having said that, some critique groups, especially here at Seven Bridge, will allow you to present the entire manuscript to your group to review in a month. And that's all they'll do for a month. Yes, please.
I think we gave them like 2 or 3 months advance.
Okay.
I was the only one brave enough so far to have a whole review, but
In your
Right.
critique
In my
group,
group,
but other
yes.
critique groups have done full manuscript.
how long is it that you give?
2 months. So what we do at Seven Bridge is, you know, you can bring in chapter by chapter up to 20 pages over a certain amount of time, where we're basically critiquing the chapters as whole entities. But then you can also, when you've completed that, ask us to do a full manuscript critique where you give it to us 2 months before. So for example, if you gave the full manuscript in July, then we would give people 2 months to read it and critique it in September. And so in the other critique groups, there have been several people who we've done all their chapters over the course of a year and then done a full manuscript. But we have had one critique group where a gentleman, we're critiquing month by month one novel, but he had another novel that he had taken through a different workshop, and we just read that whole novel in the entirety without ever having read it before, and did a full manuscript
Yeah.
critique as well.
I encourage you to take advantage of that here at Seven Bridge, because it really helps the readers who have already invested time in your novel to refresh their mind about the overall piece. And if your critique groups are anything like mine, they will tell you what they're thinking. So no worries there. Okay. The other thing, this is a great way, the critique groups workshops, great way to meet other writers. And why do you want to meet other writers? Not only for the natural networking as human beings, but they're candidate beta readers. They're candidate, you know, people who you could do kind of a quid pro quo proofing. You know, granted, you want a proofer who understands the Chicago Manual of Style, but if they don't, fresh eyes looking at your, proof is a good thing. So quid pro quo, you can set up arrangements with individuals in these groups and, leverage that. I mean, it's a good thing. It helps you all out. Yes, Paula?
The other thing about joining a critique group is those developmental aspects that Ursula spoke about, point of view, setting, description, flashback. What you'll find in the critique groups as you're critiquing other people's work is you'll discover that, wow, Ursula does descriptions well, and I want to learn from that, or Esther does dialogue really well, and I want to learn. So as you are reading and critiquing, the process of critiquing other people's work helps you to see where maybe you need to strengthen some of your craft skills, or it helps you to see, wow, I do dialogue awesome. This is actually a strength of mine, because everybody in the critique groups keeps telling me that. So you get a lot from each other.
The downside is this stuff is hard. It's hard, and it takes time, and I think it's ultimately worth it. You spend so much time writing the stupid manuscript in the first place. You make a couple of friends along the way, people read it, it's good stuff, right? And you check it, you're gonna get you will become so familiar with your manuscripts through this process of editing and critique groups that it will kind of make you a little nauseated, but it's ultimately a very good thing. And what I want to say at the end of this particular slide is judge the feedback. So I find that here in Seven Bridge in the critique groups, my own experience, when people say there's a point of view problem, there's a point of view problem. I mean, that's, it tends to be, it is what it is. I had a seasoned writer do a developmental review of my book. I think they were doing Amber War #2. And I had gone through developmental edits, and I just wanted to validate. So so this writer was reading for developmental purposes. And so in novel #2, I talk about my female protagonist, Ludmila. I talk about Ludmila's father. Novel #1, he's deported. He is in her mind. She sees him when he's not there. She talks to him. We've had that experience where someone we're close to passes on. We feel close to them. We communicate with them, right? She had that experience with her father who was deported in book 1. In book 2, I tell the reader, or I show the reader, what happens to the father, how he's living, where he is, what happens, all that thread. So this particular writer said, Daddy isn't germane to the story, get rid of him. So I respectfully neglected that piece of advice. Now, he had a point. The father was not instrumental to that, second book in the series moving forward, but I felt the reader had some attachment to that character, and I wanted to show, what was going on. So judge your feedback. Yeah. Annie was first.
I think you're saying something that I found to be really true. It's hard at first, but you have to respect what you know as a writer and a storyteller, what needs to be in your story.
Right. Absolutely. You're the ultimate expert on your manuscript, right? Yes, Esther.
I think sometimes there's a kind of natural tendency to, when you're a writer, like things that are like you write. And so I've seen that happen in critique groups where some of the editing and proposed changes were because the writer likes to write differently than I do. And you just have to value the feedback and know when to walk away from it.
Right. You'll find that especially with line editors who talk about your style and, your word uses and so forth, the actual words you use to, emphasize a scenario. Sometimes you just don't agree, So you are the judge. It's your manuscript. You have to say what's right. All right, so in terms of finding mistakes, we've had a couple of these items already come up. Proofing sheets. I use them when I write. I put a stupid table together in Microsoft Excel, and I fill it out as I write with the names. of my people, of salient dates, of locations, and all that stuff. And I refer to that as I'm writing, so I get things consistent. I don't introduce that error, although even so I introduce a few errors, even though I'm doing the proofing sheets. Now, a copy editor will create their own proofing sheet, but I'm just saying as a, a point of course, it might help you, it might ease some of your issues if you create one for yourself as you're writing. All right, changing the view screen. All right, just mixing it up. Your mind sometimes is not your friend. You're so familiar with that manuscript that you will see paragraphs that aren't there sometimes. Well, not really paragraphs, but you will see words and concepts that you maybe moved or deleted. And change the view screen. Make your eyes and your mind read what is on the screen. Make it different. Make it I don't suggest going in and changing the fonts, unless you haven't formatted yet. But there's a little toggle bar at the bottom of Word, and you can just make the whole image of that page that you're viewing bigger or smaller. Toggle it up. All right, makes sense? Or as Winona said, print out a copy. Look at the print. Or mail it to yourself. I mean, create it as a gift, unwrap it. Yeah.
And then pay for it, and look at it very differently.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea. Pay attention to your past editing comments, even in your critique groups. People, as Esther was mentioning, sometimes they gravitate on one thing. It could be stylistic, but once in a while, they'll point out a legitimate error. And, if it happens a lot, pay attention to it. Don't keep on making the same mistakes. Take this as a learning experience. If you do your own formatting, check all your formats. I've seen cases where especially new novelists have put out a format that hasn't been checked, and there are errors in Amazon. All right, check every format. Go into the simulators. Yeah, please, Anne. Okay, so if you go with a traditional publisher, the traditional publisher will take care of your digital versions and your print versions. So they'll make sure that everything's nice, it's well paginated, that the chapter headings are well spaced and all of that stuff. The right things are in the book and so forth. For people who are doing it independently, that work falls on them. So they have the job of taking the file in its electronic format when you're doing your edits, and massaging it so that it displays properly to a print-on-demand device, as well as displaying properly on a Nook or a Kindle or an iPhone. All right? That's formatting. Check your formats. Check your PDF formats. Make sure they are good. Do not assume they are good. Okay? I'm not yelling at you. I just, please don't make that mistake. It's so easy to check. I mean, it's boring. Who wants to check the 7th version of your file, But you can download emulators. You can go to all sorts of different phone formats on your desktop, on your your laptop. You can download simulators, which will show you your manuscript formatted for the iPhone. Even you can even do that. Do that work. Follow up. Do that stuff. All right. Checklists. So I make checklists. Checklists are another boring thing, but they can save you a lot of grief. I'm going to go through a couple of these only. I want to talk about editing, but finding editors, but ing and as phrases. I use this all the time. It is a bad thing. As she was lighting a cigarette, she went into the house as she was lighting a cigarette. Okay, so she's lighting a cigarette. She's got the cigarette, flicking her Bic, all right, and she's going into does she have a third arm to open the door, right? Some of this is not so obvious. Paula caught one in one of my drafts just the other day. It's not so obvious, but think about this stuff. These are subtle little bombs. Think about your as and ing sentences and make sure they work. I'm seeing some confused faces. Are we good? We're okay? All right. ly verbs. Ly verbs, bad. Ly verbs are bad. Okay, so Tom passed the Geiger counter over the strange-looking stone. It ticked. That's radioactive, he said glowingly. Right. Too many short sentences, you know, as we talked about, that's a proportion thing. Things that, when you examine that first 50 pages of your manuscript, you know, you check, if you have a tendency for certain things, throw them into a checklist, you know, and refer to that checklist because those are problems that you have. Stylize, you know, make it your own. This is not mine, but it could be. It's when I put together based, you know, as a suggestion, as something you could do. You know, keep it at your desk. When you come to a point where you want to get into some developmental editing, go through your checklist, right? You shouldn't have to remember all this. Just go through. Yeah, we don't.
Too many long sentences as well.
Absolutely.
And the problem is, and most people will pick that up after a bit if they read aloud, the same sentence structure over and over and over again, whether it's
Right.
long or short, subject, verb, modifier, object, subject, verb, and people whose experience has been primarily in technical writing or reporting tend to do that.
Yeah.
The same sentence structure over and over and over again will put your reader to sleep.
Yeah. I don't want you all standing up and saying, what?
Watch is talking to me.
I don't want you all standing up and saying, Ursula, this is ridiculous. I can't remember all this. I'm not going to do all this. This is too much. All right. Create your checklist, right? Figure out your problems. If your problem is run-on sentences, put run-on sentences in here. When you're ready to do your own developmental edit, go through your checklist, right? Make it practical for you. Don't feel inundated with all of this stuff to remember. Break it down, make it practical, make it work for you, right? All right. Again, italics, I use that as exclamation points, figures, cliche, figures of speech. I use them all the time. And the problem I have is that sometimes I feel they're appropriate in normal dialogue. They may or may not be, you know, but if you feel that, you know, you have a problem with cliche, add it to your, leave sex to the imagination. Okay, so erotica, people write erotica. I don't think anybody in this room writes erotica. Any erotica people? Okay. I do have one person in the back. If you're doing a novel about, I don't know, even a murder mystery or a thriller or, you know, a novel about hackers, whatever, you know, a sex scene is fine, but having an explicit sex scene in a novel like that is shocking to the reader. If you've got a lot of it going on, it's a different thing. But, you know, consider proportion, right? Sometimes taking the reader to the bedroom door is enough. It's more than enough.
I think
Okay.
it can get boring in some of the explicitness.
The problem is sex sells. You know, that's the catch-22. But think about it. Be aware of it. You know, is your reader going to be shocked? Will they close the book because of that?
Or if you read a book and all you can remember is, boy, there was a lot of sex in there. That's
Yeah.
not what.
Yeah, Paula.
The other thing too is as you think about it, think about how wide you want your readership or sellability to be. We had one woman who wrote this amazing coming-of-age story about this young girl who lost her mother and her father is starting to have Alzheimer's. And amazing, amazing story, really well done book. But she has this sex scene in it that's pretty explicit, you know, with this young girl's first time. And what I explained to her was, there are people whom I would not be able to recommend her book to, even though it's such an amazing book without that sex scene. So I told her that if it didn't have that, I could recommend it to 100%
Right.
of my friends. But because of the scenes in it, I can only recommend it to 50% of my friends. So she's now lost that readership.
Right.
So.
Right, that's a good point. Think about your readership with these, with sex scenes. Same thing with profanity. I have a friend who writes short stories predominantly, and he wrote a short story. We were at Mill 5 in Lowell. I was with a couple of people who were doing readings, short story readings at Mill 5. And he read a story where the F word was like in every sentence, and it was appropriate to the story. At least it seemed to be to a degree. I felt it was a little bit overused. But, you know, the thing is, the audience heard this. You know, I told my story about, you know, a woman fishing, and then, you know, there was another story about some, you know, very calm subject. And this third person came up with his story where obscenity was in every sentence. It was such a shock, people in the audience laughed. They were surprised by it. But the thing is, it didn't make for a good story. So watch your obscenity. The other thing with obscenity, people swear in different ways. So don't have all your characters swear the same way. Right? And if you're gonna use an obscenity, make it count. Really make. Don't use the F word everywhere. Put one in and really make it stand out. Okay? And again, you know, the first 50 pages, remind yourself. Okay? I'm going to go through a couple more checklists really quick. You know, these are things, again, you can tailor to your own use. You might, I mean, if you have a problem with certain words, for me, lie and lay, I still get it wrong. Principal, principal, borrow land, regardless, irregardless, bring, take. If you have problems with any words like this, throw it on a spreadsheet, put it near your computer, take a look at it as you're writing. You know, make it simple. Yeah? Does that resonate?
Although it's pretty easy to go into Google and say, just start typing it, and other people have the same mistakes, so
It's a good thing to do, but
you have to remember.
it takes you out of your writing. You know, it's a different thing to look over there and say, you know, this is what I need to do versus putting up Google, doing the search, reading the things. You can do it, yes, it's workable, thank goodness we have all these tools available to us, but whatever works for you. For me, it works right on my, you know. Misused words are on my next one. Again, as you have your first manuscript, your second manuscript, copy edited. If you have problem words, you know, put them on your list. Get past it. Learn how to do it right. Criteria, data, whether data is plural or singular, you know. Criteria, whether it's plural or singular, you know, that kind of stuff. Are we okay? All right, so let's get into finding an editor. So you're at a point where you've sweated over your manuscript, you've put your heart and soul into it, and now you need to get into editing process. So how are you going to find an editor? So word of mouth is a great thing. Seven Bridge, you know, through your contacts at Seven Bridge, you know, most of us know a lot of people. You can find people. Winona knows everybody in the town of Fitchburg, I think. So, you know, it's easy, you know, use your contacts, find out who's been using an editor, whether they like them, whether it works. Now, there are some, Winona, you were talking about this earlier, there's some organizations or professional affiliates. There's the Editorial Freelancers Association, the Independent Editors Group. You can look at those for editor suggestions. When you are searching for an editor, you know, if you have picked an editor and you want to consider them, check their references. You know, think of an editor like hiring a plumber. You know, check the references. Yeah. One thing that I think is very useful is ask the prospective editor to do a sample edit. And they'll tell you how much they want you to send. I mean, if you bring this up, they'll say, okay, send me 1,000 words or whatever, 2,000 words, I don't know how much. Did Stacy ask you to? What,
It seemed
couple
like
of thousand?
she said
A few
I
pages.
pulled out like 5,
Okay.
a little bit more
Okay.
to give a little context.
So they'll tell you how much, you know, 5 pages, whatever. Pick it in the middle, pick the pages in the middle of your manuscript. The beginning of your manuscript you tend to spend a lot of time on. You spend a lot of time on the end because you've thought it through, right? Pick something in the middle.
I had to give her a cheat sheet because it was in the middle.
Yeah.
She had to kind of know what,
Some context.
who was what.
Yeah, yeah. But do that. Pick the stuff that hasn't been edited, hasn't been well vetted. All right, and give that to the end and see what they do. If they come back with comments that you don't agree with, if they're not excited about your stuff, maybe it's time to move on.
Yeah, Stacy and I haven't done the final draft because I'm waiting for one more read, but one of my criteria was that she be willing to discuss the changes that she thought I should make. So I
Absolutely.
understand the importance of that.
Absolutely. Now, some editors will do that and some won't. So that's why it's important to talk to your editors your prospective editors beforehand. See the kind of editing they do, see if you can communicate with them, if you're on the same page, if they're excited about your manuscript. If you can find one that specializes in your genre, I mean, Ray, if you find an editor that specializes in Revolutionary War, right? That's what you write about, right? No.
Well, but
Close
close enough.
enough. If you find a 1800s Central Massachusetts, if you find an editor, that has some background or has some familiarity with the subject, all the better, all the better. But really, you want to be able to talk to them. You want to feel that they have your interests at heart. And some editors can be very aloof. I mean, I'll tell you, you really have to shop. You really have to decide yourself, and it can be expensive. You're talking about some serious bucks, so you want to do a good job selecting them. Be clear about where you are in the writing process and what kind of editing you want done. And go back to that sheet. Remember, we had developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, proofing. Go back to that sheet. And even don't, if you get hung up on the terms, forget about the terms and look at the characteristics. Do you talk about story arc? Do you talk about overall story? Or do you get down, now, do you do style? Ask them if they do style and word usage. If they don't, they're probably a copy editor. But if they do, then ask them if they know about the Chicago Manual of Style. And if they do both, great. If they don't know about the Chicago, you'll know that they're just a line editor. So think this through in your head just so that you know what you're getting and you know what you're paying for. Does this make sense now? All right. Discuss what you're trying to accomplish by writing this book. And most importantly, get your fees in writing, right? Having said that, I don't do that. I don't get the fees in writing. The people that help me with my books at this stage, I've worked with for so long. They've been with me for 5 books now. It's all the same characters. So I don't do that. But if Stacy comes to me and says, Ursula, I can take your book on August 1st, I make sure my book is ready on August 1st. Yes?
I'm curious, so you've written several novels now, so you're kind of, getting better as you go along. And I just wondered, when you did your first one and then you started getting some feedback, professional feedback, can you summarize kind of, characterize what you were hearing back that you had to go back and kind of fix?
Sure, that's a great question. So my first novel, Purple Trees, I put everything I could into the manuscript. I thought it was done. And then I had an editor do a developmental edit. And they came back with a page of comment. And the primary issue that they saw was that the novel was kind of, sort of, a little bit into the paranormal. And it wasn't there, and she suggested either going there or coming back. That required a tremendous amount of rewrite. Then my publisher did a developmental edit after I absorbed that comment and made significant changes. Then my publisher, who is a brilliant developmental editor, had many developmental suggestions. So I ended up rewriting 60% of the novel, and then he had more developmental issues. It was a process, and I had trouble getting a good, solid storyline. It was a little bit of an unusual scenario in terms of the story itself, but I had trouble really nailing it. So they helped me with this, and I went through at least 4 developmental edits before I had something that I could really work on. So that was my first novel experience. Now, I don't know if you all, Esther, I don't think your experience was the same. So everybody's different, and
I was rewriting for 2 years, and
2 years,
it's
okay.
still.
But that's, I mean, it takes what it takes. And one of my writing friends said to me that, that first novel is like getting your master's degree. I mean, it takes that level of commitment and rework and focus, but you need to put that in to have a good product at the end, right? And then now the second novel gets a little bit easier, the third gets easier. I find at the fourth and the fifth that it's just as hard as it was, but it's harder for different reasons. Is the plot complex enough? Am I explaining enough? Am I, unwrapping this world sufficiently? Are my characters sufficiently complex? Those are different questions from, is this a readable story? So you evolve as you go forward, and it's a good thing, right?
I'm sorry I don't remember who this was, but recently I read a book, and it was mentioned that the author, I think it took 11 years of rewrites, and I think it probably depends on your level of craft development before you even try to, what you bring to the table initially.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Although a friend of mine says the view is always the same from the edge, but the edge is moving. As you learn, the only way to know is to go back and look at the old stuff and realize how much better you are. But when you're on the edge, the view is always the same. You don't know.
Winona, who is an educator, might disagree with this, but I think that writing a novel is a good way to learn how to write a novel.
Oh, no.
No, you agree?
That's absolutely true.
Yeah, okay.
And I'll bring up both Hemingway and Thomas Wolfe. Hemingway rewrote the last two sentences of Farewell to Arms 34 times. Those last two sentences, and when someone, I don't know if it was Maxwell Perkins, asked him why, he said, I have to get the words right.
Yeah.
And this is a skilled writer. Thomas Wolfe had a 5,000-page manuscript of the most beautiful writing anyone could imagine, and Maxwell Perkins brought it down to 1,500 word pages.
Yeah.
So, and he and Faulkner are probably America's best writers, period.
I mean, their literary expertise is remarkable. But still, absolutely. And to Ray's earlier point, it's, I know first-time novelists who want the novel done. They want to publish it. They want to go on to their second novel. It's not good to rush it. You don't want to put it in a drawer for 3 years unless you have to. I mean, it's good to keep it up to get it done. But having said that, you don't really want to slam it through. You want to trust the process to help you do a better job. Trust that editors will do this. Your critique groups will help you. Trust the process. Everybody's first drafts, well, I'm not saying everybody, but I think pretty much everybody's first drafts are problematic. But go through the critique groups, have your friends read it, have your husband read it if you still want to, but go through the process, hire the editor, have the publisher come back to you, go through the process, it will improve. Yes, Paula?
Well, and also I want to say, having led, substantial number of critique groups, trust yourself too. What I found is a lot of folks in the critique groups, they'll tell us, they'll say, this chapter, I wrote it, but it's not working for me, I can't get it right. And sometimes you have that sense, already what does or doesn't work. And sometimes, you might not listen to yourself because you do have people who might say, oh, everything you do is wonderful. And it is wonderful, but sometimes that you need more work on something. And we get that all the time in the critique groups where people are saying, this is fabulous, and then the author will say, well, I don't know, this chapter's not working for me, or this doesn't make sense, or I don't know about this character.
Right. Your response, you take all this feedback and you have to churn it through, find out what makes sense, and then do what you think is right for your manuscript. I mean, this is, it's a reflection of you in a way. So, yeah. Yes, please, Winona.
We do call this project-based learning, and you're absolutely right. If you do what we've just heard today, if you do it right, absolutely, it's the best way to learn anything.
Yeah.
Learn by doing.
So what's wrong? Do we see? Yeah, original. It wasn't hard to find these, by the way. So advice is a bad word. I think we mentioned some of this earlier. Learn from your editors. Make note of your consistent mistakes. I have a lot of trouble with apostrophes. Fix what you don't understand. Learn, you know? Don't make the same mistakes. Challenge your editors to find brand new mistakes with your new novels, right? Study grammar and word usage. Read widely. Become familiar with a good reference. Now, Elements of Style by White and Skunk, I mean, that's considered a cornerstone. I think probably it's a small book, as Esther says, but we probably all have it on our shelf somewhere in the dust. The Chicago Manual of Style, it's definitive for fiction. The AP Style Guide is for blogs and articles. There is a nonfiction reference, which is considered biblical. There's even a style guide for social sciences. So,
Are there tools that will help pick up on some of this? I mean, you mentioned word count with script, and I gotta look that up. Are there other tools that pick up on some of these things? As you could run your manuscript through.
Well,
Grammarly might be the
well,
big
I mean,
one.
at a basic level, I mean, you don't want it to fix all your stuff. But
And
if you're looking for very obvious grammar mistakes, Grammarly will pop it up.
It will pop up a certain category of mistake. Grammarly will not replace a copy editor. Now, Joyce uses Grammarly. I don't use Grammarly. I feel that my copy editor is going to get all of those issues plus other issues. But, you know, having said that, there's a free version of Grammarly out there. In fact, I have a slide. Do you want to see a slide about Grammarly? Here's Grammarly. It does grammar and punctuation, spell check, readability. You can buy a license and get additional features. There's a free on www.grammarly.com. And here are some of the features. Again, I just did this so I would have some information for you. It'll do grammar and spelling, punctuation, vocabulary, gene-specific style check, plagiarism detector. But again, the premium does some of this. The free just does grammar and spelling. Okay, so yes, Winona.
Microsoft Word, the full version, actually, I mean, student or teacher, whatever it is that I have, will do at least 2/3 of that. Plus,
Yeah.
Word will give you the Flesch-Kincaid readability score,
Yep.
which is, depending on who your audience is and what you want to say, is very, very helpful. Just going through that little grammar check, that's not bad, but it's not going to make you a better writer. It's going to make you look somewhat less stupid.
It'll make you less stupid. It'll flag some errors, just as, I know you're a Scrivener fan, but it doesn't replace a person who is trained and professional who can go through the whole raft of issues. So,
Again, with the goal in mind of getting it better before you do that.
right.
The other
Yes,
thing
please.
that Word will do is they have a feature where it will read it out loud for you, and you can pick the voices that you want it to read out, and so you can sit there and listen, and when they are reading it out, suddenly you will realize a word's missing in the sentence, or there's a pause that you didn't have a comma for, or, you know, the sentence makes completely no sense because the way they read it. And so, and that's a useful feature if you're just doing the pre-editing so that you can cut down on how much money you have to pay somebody
Okay.
else.
Good point.
Where
Good
was
point.
that?
You have to go under the review section, and then in there you'll find the tabs
In
that,
Word.
yeah, and it'll read it for you.
Okay. I want to spend a minute on commas. I have a horrible time with commas. There are rules for commas. I think a lot of people, do you have trouble with commas? I think everybody has trouble with commas. There are rules, and, you know, to separate free modifiers. What's a free modifier? I don't know. So, bottom one is the most important point. You as the writer, you know how your characters are speaking. You know what they're emphasizing. You know their intonation. Sometimes you're going to put punctuation for that character as you want the reader to see them. Now, your copy editor may have a cow about this. You need to decide what's right. Winona's making a face.
Oh, yes, we're gonna have to go to the back on that one. There are empty
Let-
dashes and semicolons and all kinds of things you can do without misusing a comma, just saying.
So you have 2 points of view. I personally think that just in terms of practical steps forward, do your best with commas. Now, your copy editor is gonna identify problems with commas, fix them. If your proofreader finds a few more issues, great. If your proofreader comes back and says you have 200 problems with commas, I would go back to the copy editor and validate. All right. Oh, we have a good one coming up.
That's what my stuff looks like at 3 in the morning.
Yep.
All of it.
Spell checkers usually get those words, but all right, a couple of references. This first one, the self-editing for fiction writers, Brown and King, excellent, excellent reference. Excellent.
Is this in your,
Yes,
Okay.
yes, that'll be in there, yes. And the library should have a copy, it should be in the system, the Lancaster, whatever Lancaster system is, but that is a really good book. It's not too big. That is a really, really good book. And, here are some other references on writing. I like Gardner's book, The Art of Fiction, even though he is arrogant. These are some others that you may be familiar with, The Stuff of Fiction, Burning Down the House. Stephen King on writing. I don't like that book, but in the back, he's got a list of books that showcase various writing styles and craft techniques. It's a couple hundred books. That is an excellent list. I would suggest you read that list. I'm about 70% through. Yes?
Under Away, her book, and I think it's been edited since then, by the professors in Florida. Name escaped me. She's gone through, I think, 8 editions, and they've been out of print, and then back in print, and then out of print. So you're gonna see $98 for this book, but Pearson, I think, then was down to like 7 because they were old, and then Pearson bought them, it's up to about 40. But keep looking, because that is a standard, and as it goes in and out of print and availability, we're all angry because Pearson bought the book, and now it's pricey again. But it's standard,
Okay.
just hard to find.
Okay.
And any of the editions are fine.
All right. I hope you got something out of today. I hope that the bottom line is that, all of this stuff, it's a lot. I know it's a lot. Everybody knows it's a lot. I mean, you read all this stuff about what you can do with editing. You want to run out of the room. And thank you for not. But break it down. Try to understand what you do as a writer. You know your mistakes. Try not to repeat them. Treat editing as a necessary job to improving your manuscript. And you want to, this is your product, right? For those independent, and even for the traditional market, this is your product, right? So do the best job possible, follow the steps, break it down, make it work for you. You don't have to look at, 4 or 5 different potential craft issues in your manuscript. Look at 1 or 2, but make it better. Make your concerted effort to read it aloud, check your dialogue. Sit down and make your husband listen to your dialogue or your wife listen to your dialogue. Workshops are great, and I know a lot of you are in workshops. I encourage that. I think that's a wonderful thing. Hiring a professional, I think, especially for the independent folks in the room, that's a necessity at some point. Be careful. Make sure you know have an idea of what you want to do in terms of the edit, and talk to the prospective editor. Get on the same page with respect to what they can do and what might help you. Get your cost in writing. Practice your craft. You know, treat writing, basic writing, the elements of craft is, you know, practicing your dribble, practicing your layup, right? It's the same thing. Well, it's not the same thing, but it's the same concept. All right, any questions? Any thoughts?
Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome. All right, thanks.
Say thank you
Thanks,
to our
everyone.
class.